Hello, my name is Terry Irwin, and I'm a professor in the School of Design at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh and the director of the Transition Design Institute there. I'm going to screen share with you now and begin a lecture talking about transition design. So I'm really pleased to be here with you today for this International Design Colloquium. I'm going to talk to you about a project that I just finished with my two co-researchers, Gideon Kossoff and Tim Gasparek, to map COVID-19 in the US through the lens of transition design. This is very much work in progress, and at best a sketch for further research, which would involve a wide range of stakeholders and experts over much longer arcs of time. Transition design is a new transdisciplinary approach for seeding systems-level change and catalyzing societal transitions toward more sustainable, equitable, and desirable long-term futures. Unlike other areas of design focus, such as product or service design or design for social innovation, transition design argues that designers cannot be the only experts in the room. Rather, they are members of transdisciplinary teams collaborating to address large, complex, wicked problems that cannot be solved by a single individual or discipline. Wicked problems are systems problems with many challenging characteristics, such as every wicked problem is unique and constantly changing. There is no clear shared problem definition. There are multiple stakeholders with conflicting agendas, and these problems straddle organizational and disciplinary boundaries. And every wicked problem is connected to other wicked problems. Wicked problems are things like this: income inequality, climate change, terrorism, loss of biodiversity, lack of access to affordable housing and education, and as we're seeing right now in my country, pandemics, racism, and police brutality. These interrelated, interdependent problems form what we call wicked problem clusters, which I will talk more about in a moment. Transition design argues that these large, complex problems need to be framed within even larger problem contexts. But most design-related disciplines and subdisciplines do exactly the opposite. As designers, we find or are given a tightly framed problem, such as a lack of homeless shelters in Pittsburgh, and we investigate this issue and perhaps interview some constituencies or stakeholders connected to it. But usually we would not ask if the problem we're working on is really just a symptom of something larger. So our solution will probably be to design and build a homeless shelter. If, however, we begin to trace the roots of the problem up to a higher systems level, we might end up redefining the problem as a lack of affordable housing. But if we trace the roots of the problem up even higher to, say, the city level, we might arrive at the wicked problem of homelessness in Pittsburgh, and that is a big wicked problem. But wait, it gets worse. Remember that I said most wicked problems are connected to other wicked problems? If you include the other related problems as part of the overall problem context, it gets really gnarly and it starts to look like this. And this is the point at which we realize that no single individual or discipline can solve a wicked problem. It requires transdisciplinary collaboration over long arcs of time to effectively address one. And it takes one more very important thing: a better understanding of systems themselves, how they behave, and how they transition over time. Essentially, we all need to become students of systems. And systems themselves are best explained by this old joke. Two fish bump into each other and one says, "How's the water?" And the other replies, "What water?" Marshall McLuhan, in his book War and Peace in the Global Village, said, "One thing fish know nothing about is water, since they have no anti-environment which would enable them to perceive the element that they live in. Systems are so ubiquitous and our interactions with them are so pervasive, we don't really see them, and therefore we don't understand them very well. My work is concerned with how we learn to see systems and understand how they behave. In particular, it's concerned with how our societal systems transition over time. So we live in a world of systems nested within systems, nested within systems. There are transportation systems, infrastructural systems, financial, economic, and communication systems, and all of these are permeated by cultural and disciplinary norms, laws, informal practices, and ways of doing things. And together, all of these form what are known as socio-technical systems, which are in turn embedded within the natural world. And these systems are always in transition. But despite this constant movement, socio-technical systems are highly resistant to change. They get set in their ways just like we do. But change they can, as a result of three things: large and small events, technological innovations and breakthroughs, and changes in beliefs, social norms, and practices. So in both material and non-material ways. And any of these changes can happen either suddenly or gradually. But let's come back to the concept of transition. Human societies are always in transition, but these transitions have been largely unintentional, full of drift, and we really only understand their ramifications in hindsight. We call it history. The question before all of us in the 21st century is whether we can intentionally transition our societies and organizations toward more sustainable, equitable, and desirable long-term futures. Transition design argues that the long-term futures we're currently transitioning toward aren't necessarily the futures we want, but argues that we can intentionally shift these transition trajectories toward futures we do want. Now, it sounds like a monumental undertaking, but if we use the current situation to think about transition trajectories, we can see that all of these countries started out at more or less the same place. And we've learned that small changes in the present can make a big difference in where you end up in the future. Transition design is essentially an approach to intentionally shift systems trajectories. The MLP is a framework used to explain how socio-technical systems change and transition over long periods of time. And there are three key levels: the landscape, the regime or status quo, and the niche. The landscape level are where large events, collective beliefs, and social norms begin to impact and fracture the regime level below. Landscape level forces usually accrue and exert gradual pressure, but as you can see here, events like war, 9/11, and COVID-19 can appear suddenly and unexpectedly, creating sweeping change throughout the system. The niche level is where small experiments and innovations can be incubated off the radar and go unchallenged by the status quo. Niche level events include things like new inventions, technologies, and practices, or even radical new policy ideas such as universal basic income. But the important thing to know is that large, unexpected events like COVID-19 always open up opportunities at the niche level that can be exploited for good or bad if you know how to read the system dynamics. I'm going to show you just two examples of how change happens in socio-technical systems. Here, conditions already present at the regime level began to constellate and exert pressure from within, opening a fracture and letting niche-level innovations rush in. Startups like Airbnb and Uber, combined with social networking platforms and technologies, exploited the fracture and rushed into the regime. And the speed at which they were absorbed into and transformed the regime was astounding. Their integration created more fractures, and new industry ecologies formed around both Uber and Airbnb, becoming also part of the regime and utterly transforming multiple industry sectors, such as tourism. Now, a decade later, what started as a niche-level sharing economy experiment has permeated the regime and moved up to become the sharing economic paradigm at the landscape level. But with these transitions come myriad unintended consequences in the form of wicked problems, like the ones in red. This is how the regime has looked for some time now. But just a couple of months ago, Uber laid off more than 6,000 people, and Airbnb has now laid off 25% of their workforce, all because of a major disruption at the landscape level known as COVID-19, our second example, which showed up suddenly as a problem of nearly unprecedented global magnitude. You can actually watch it fracturing the regime in real time, igniting a flurry of niche-level activity that is nearly impossible to follow, but which contains within it the seeds of paradigmatic change for both good and bad. And as we watch this accelerated transition that we're all in, we need to anticipate the unintended consequences of the solutions and innovations that are being hastily implemented, so that before they turn into wicked problems, we begin to intervene and try to drive positive systems level change. For the past 2.5 months, we've been mapping COVID-19 in the US. First, we map the problem in these 5 categories in the present to understand its interconnections, feedback loops, and stuck places. In the second phase of research, we went back in time and used the MLP to try and understand how the problem evolved, to reveal new insights from the past that could deepen our understanding of and response to the problem in the present. These 2 phases of research, when combined with a third foresighting and backcasting phase, create a radically large problem context that includes past, present, and future. The problem map reveals the system's dynamics, feedback loops, and conflicting stakeholder agendas that can be barriers or advantages to problem resolution. I'll quickly walk you around the problem map so you can see that it looks at many different facets of the problem. Key insights or issues that are pivotal or urgent have been highlighted in the red boxes. This map is quite large. It's actually about 22 feet tall. And because of the lockdown and quarantine, all of our research has been secondary, meaning it has come from mostly mainstream news media and special reports. Let's start in the environmental issues section, where we see that COVID-19 is of zoonotic origins, meaning viruses like this make the leap from animals to humans when their habitats are destroyed and new interactions between species occur, and/or they are brought into contact with humans, usually via wet markets, which we see in the economics section is part of a $73 billion luxury food industry in which wild animals are captured or farmed for consumption or for use in Chinese medicine. So even though we've known about the connection between the destruction of wildlife habitats, viruses like COVID-19, and wet markets for a very long time, this industry has grown to employ 1 million people, making it nearly impossible to close down. And if we look at legislation to try and regulate this problem in the political and governance section, we see that policies banning the sale of wild animals are likely to drive the entire industry underground, resulting in a black market that would remove what few oversights currently exist, which could in turn trigger even more pandemics. The social issues section looks at what we think and how we act. Here, we see that our attitudes about and relationship to animals is one of the root causes of the pandemic. Many disease experts argue that we should view the pandemic as a warning that humans must begin to see animals as partners whose health and habitat welfare is tied to our own. And these attitudes are connected to the higher level issue of collective beliefs and worldviews. And here we see that American beliefs about civil liberties, individual freedoms, and the right to bear arms have impeded an effective response to the pandemic and led to nationwide protests. But valid concerns underlie many of the quarantine protests. About half of US workers' health insurance is tied to their employment, and 1 in 5 workers has lost their jobs, leaving about 27 million Americans without health care and the ability to meet their basic needs. In the economic and business section, we see that this issue is connected to the United States privatized for-profit healthcare industry that is part of a larger economic system that places shareholder profit above the welfare and job security of its workers. This profit imperative is part of a national system that pits the welfare of the economy and corporate profits against the welfare of its workers and citizens. And of course, the backdrop for all of this has been an extremely polarized political landscape, which has contributed to the virus's spread and the country's faltering response to it. Back in the social issues section, we see that the pandemic has left many groups especially vulnerable, and especially our African American and Black populations who are contracting the virus and dying from it in shockingly disproportionate numbers. So here you see the final map with the key insights and root issues highlighted in the red boxes on the left. These are used for the basis for the next phase of research, which uses the MLP framework to trace the historic origins of these roots and insights. This map is also large. It's about 18 feet long. And we pull out narrative threads and insights about the past that help us understand the problem in the present. Here we see that our 18th century Southern enslavement economy contributed to more than 400 years of institutionalized racism in the US, which led to our Black community's vulnerability to the pandemic and the now interconnected problems of racism and police brutality in the US. Our research also traces the origins and evolutions of the US healthcare system and helps explain why it is so broken today. During the same time period, we also see that the coronavirus was discovered in 1967. So for over half a century, we've known about it. We've known that it's zoonotic in origin and that it gets into the human disease stream through the capture and consumption of wild animals and the destruction of their habitats through deforestation. So going forward, the frequency of pandemics will likely coincide with the increasing rate of deforestation. Coming into the present, we see that COVID-19 is predictably opening up a flurry of activity at the niche level, and this is what we all need to keep our eye on right now. So transition design research like this aims to produce a deeper understanding of the problem and its roots. And when combined with long-term visioning undertaken by the stakeholders themselves, has the potential to open up new and more effective strategies for problem resolution. The objective is to develop ecologies of systems interventions that solve for multiple problems simultaneously. If our research continues, however, it will need to encompass this entire problem cluster with the aim of designing interventions that address these problems simultaneously and begin to seed systems level change and transitions toward a more sustainable future. The transition design approach is aimed at several things. One, it leverages knowledge from within the system and frames problems within radically large contexts. It facilitates a shared understanding of the problem and enables stakeholders to co-create visions of long-term futures that they actually want. Our time is very short, but the problem maps that I showed you today are now available on my academia.edu website. And if you would like to know more about transition design, the syllabus for our master's and doctoral seminars in transition design is up online. Thank you, and I believe right now I can begin answering questions.